Hello and welcome back. I know I look very familiar. I told you I would. Today is the continuation of my September 9/11 reads. I would love if you guys have any suggestions for me. Although first, if you wouldn't mind just going to check on what I may have already done. Today is With Their Eyes, and it's not even a book. It's actually a play. It doesn't necessarily have an author. It is edited by this woman named Annie Toms, who she put the whole project together essentially. She worked at, please forgive me if I butcher the name, Stuyvesant High School in New York. I believe it's in Brooklyn. Maybe it's not in Brooklyn because after 9/11 they are relocated to Brooklyn. They are right there at ground zero essentially, and so their school gets turned into a triage center. She is a faculty member at this high school, and she is also in charge of the drama department. In the aftermath, their school got shut down. It was only a couple days into school. It's a different age. There is not social media. There's not this great way to keep in touch electronically and to share how we're feeling. Maybe there was like a school message board. There was something in which she read what students were posting about how they felt and their experiences. She decided, based off of some other award-winning plays that were centered around tragic events, that she's going to try this in her own school. She gathers a handful of students. They interview people, staff, teachers, lunchroom workers, custodians, students from all walks of life and from all grade levels, and they are then going to consolidate these stories into monologues. My first read through, and then even this read through, my absolute favorite part, and then added on to that, my favorite sections were the ones that were almost factual. Like the beginning of the book, if you've seen my review of Love is Higher Than Law by David Levithan, you know I didn't love it. And so then when I opened this one, thankful, because still sick here, I was like, holy cow, it's another short read. Thank you, Jesus, you love me. But he gave the foreword, and I was like, I personally, based off of his 9/11 book, I don't think he is the utmost authority on giving a foreword for this book, but that seems to be why he was chosen. I enjoyed the introduction where we learn the circumstances for this play, and then we learn facts of the day and even facts of the ensuing year. And then we learn about the students who put this play together and what they're doing now, including one who had sadly passed away. There are now some adverse health effects from breathing in the air and the dust and everything. It's hypothesized that her cancer was actually attributed to the 9/11 syndrome, in which she breathed things in, like carcinogens and whatnot, and they affected her body over time, and she ended up dying. So I really liked the beginning, and then the monologues that I liked the most were the ones that gave me an emotional pull, but also gave me information about the mindset. Like, this is how I felt the day of. This is how I felt in the aftermath, or this is how it affected me. What I was also going to say, my first read, I didn't like it. I liked the beginning, but then I opened it up to the actual first chapter, and I was like, this is a bunch of poems. I don't want to read a bunch of poems, but it was very enjoyable. It's not that boring poetry blah stuff. And it was quite interesting. I was like, I could never be in the drama department. That sounds really hard. I quite enjoyed the formatting. It made it more bearable. It made it more interesting, and it made it more impactful. So, as I said, lots of interviews. I actually was really confused in the explanation of what they were going to do with these interviews, because it made it sound like they were going to compile the interviews and then make them all into one monologue. And I was like, how are you gonna do that? But really what it was is, I don't know, 7, 8 actors, they're all on stage the entire time, and they have their monologue from this interview, and then somebody else is gonna go, and then while they're doing that, they're gonna change into the persona for their next monologue. So it's really interesting. I am just gonna bring you my favorites. For various reasons, they're the ones that stood out to me the most. There were a couple that felt rambling, and I didn't understand the point. And that's the thing, is this play doesn't necessarily have a plot. So it's hard to talk about this book because it's not a normal book. I had some that I was like, why are you included? But then I had some that I was like, you hit me where I needed to be hit, or you have given me information that I need for my own sake. First is Ilya Felcherov, who was an immigrant, or is an immigrant from Russia. He is like, for the majority of my life, this is where I called home. It was picture day. He had gotten all dressed up for picture day. Then obviously there is no picture day, but then he'd had a phone, and he left it in his locker, because back in those days, if you did have a phone, you were not allowed to have it with you. These kids these days just don't get it. It's a completely different world. He had gone to get his phone because people needed to be able to contact their loved ones, and he thought maybe he could help. It's like going to a Braves game and you can't use the internet because everybody is using the internet. Puts his phone back, and then when they're being evacuated, he's like, oh, let me get my phone again because, my friend really wants to be able to call so-and-so, and it still doesn't work. So he puts it back, and he's like, then I couldn't come back to school for 2 weeks. So my phone is in my locker along with this 2-week-old sandwich, or maybe it was even longer than that. I actually can't remember. We'll jump into the shoe shiner. So I did not write him down here, but I thought this was a really poignant moment, because the guy was the one where if you got caught skipping class, he was the one that caught you. And he made this point of saying that the day before was like, I'm gonna shine my shoes. And then he looks down the day of, and he notices how his shoes are so dirty. They're so covered in ash and filth that there was no point in him shining his shoes. And then he goes on this train of thought of, what if I had never shined my shoes, would this have ever happened? And it was very interesting, because we all rationally, as does he, know that him shining his shoes had nothing to do with 9/11 occurring. But it's the butterfly effect, where, like, what if one small act could have changed everything? I love these little moments that we would get from these interviews. Let's go on to Max Willens, who's also a senior. What I liked about him was he was displaced due to 9/11. It's very reminiscent of Claire from Love is Higher Than Law, where he was not able to go back to his home. He had to go live with family. And to be honest, when his monologue started, I couldn't tell if his homelessness was before or after 9/11. Eventually, it becomes clear that what he's talking about is due to 9/11. It's just interesting how he, much like Claire, kind of has a hard time adjusting, has a hard time facing reality, and therefore he has a hard time sleeping, and he's always trying to distract himself from thinking about this one thing. But everything he had fit into a plastic bag. He had his backpack and he had a plastic bag, and if he ever needed anything, his mom had to pay for it. Eventually, they are let back into their home. What he first notices, they had left their windows open. It was like a black and white movie. Everything was black and white. Everything was dirty, and I didn't want to be there. And then I go to my room, and it's pristine. Everything has color. So if you've ever seen Pleasantville, it reminded me of that, where you are in black and white one moment, and then in the next you are just full of color. And for him, he was so thankful to be able to grab things that he wore like 3 shirts just because that's what felt normal. It felt normal to finally be able to take his own clothing and wear his own clothing without his parents having to buy it for him just because they had nothing. Next, a girl named Katie, who was a freshman, and I liked her because she was a breath of fresh air. Stuyvesant was closed, and the students for a certain period of time were relocated basically to their rival school. And to me, this is all mind-blowing. Stuyvesant is an elective school of sorts where it is for very high achieving students. So it's not a normal high school. It's for people who, in my day, we had the college prep track, and then we had, I forget what it's called, but the track for people who weren't planning to go to college, and so they were learning more life skills like auto shop and things like that. This was for a school for people who were high achievers. So when I read the introduction of this book, I tried not to feel discouraged about my own path in life, because I was like, I did not achieve nearly as much as all these kids who took place in this play did. Like a school of 3,000, and then they have to go to, I think it's called Brooklyn Tech, and that's a school like 4,000. So just the description of these schools. Stuyvesant, it was at least 10 stories tall. And I get it, they build up because they can't necessarily build out, but I was just like, wow. And even the description of Brooklyn Tech and how all that worked, it was mind-blowing. Brooklyn Tech students would go to school in the morning. Stuyvesant would come in the afternoon until the evening. This freshman who had only gotten to experience Stuyvesant for 3 days before all this happened, she's experiencing this new normal, and she's noting how everybody around her is like, oh, we miss Sty. And she's like, we have 25-minute classes. Our school day is like 5 hours long. We start at 1:30 in the afternoon. What in the heck are you guys talking about? And have you seen the state of our school right now? Why would you want to go there? I enjoyed her because I felt like on some level she spoke for the majority of the population. That was my personal reaction, was not necessarily that, but like, why is this a big deal? Why are we bemoaning this situation? Because I was far removed from it. Nobody explained to me what the Twin Towers were. Nobody explained to me the ramifications. I'm actually very surprised reading these books how many of these students and characters automatically jumped to terrorism, because I was like, at 15, that's not what that meant to me. It felt like an accident that people were overreacting to. I think I identified with her, which is why she stuck out to me. And then we have this guy named Kevin, who I liked him because he told it like it was, in a way that I don't feel like a lot of stories do, where we see him experience the first tower. He had been able to see the first plane hit, which it's not documented. I don't know how many people actually saw that, because we were all paying attention by the time the second plane hit. But honestly, you just had to be right time, right place to see the first one. He brings it up to his fellow classmates, and I guess they were aware of it, but it was a joke. Like, people were not taking this whole thing seriously, which again, I can relate to. Like, it's shocking to an extent where you're like, that can't be real. And the initial thought was that something was wrong with the pilot of the plane, so it was an accident. But then all these people who've been laughing and joking for the first one start to get really serious with the second one, and he's like, but why weren't you like this with the first plane? And he has all this insight into what a new normal is, and I really enjoy this perspective from him, because he's a kid by all intents and purposes, and he had this really firm understanding and outlook on the ramifications of what he just experienced. We come back to Max Willens. I thought this was really interesting because they were recording these things, and I guess they did not always interview in school. And then the interview got cut off. When it ended, I was like, what do you mean he got interrupted? Like, we're not gonna pick back up where we left off after the interruption? So what happens is, actually they're talking, and this stranger overhears them to some capacity and starts giving his 2 cents. And this is when, for me, I got an opposing perspective politically about the whole thing, because the interview had veered in like a fiscal direction and about how we had our priorities wrong, and how this guy had been thinking, maybe because people were living the high life at this point, like they were making money, they were spending money, and he was like, what if there's a catastrophic event that changes the way people value what they have or have in front of them? This guy just like pops in and gives his 25 cents about everything from A to Z. So it was actually really interesting the way that they flowed the whole thing. We come back to Max Willens. His anger stemmed from the way that outsiders would treat 9/11, how it more of a photo op than it was something to be remembered and revered. I love this idea that he refused to help people take their pictures, because he's like, well, in his head, he had this whole retort. I don't think he ever actually said it to anybody, but it was like, oh, hey, so when something catastrophic happens in your backyard, I'll make sure that I know where to stand so that I can get a commemorative picture. So I thought it was a necessary statement. It's very true. The 9/11 memorial and this whole idea of the event is to remember. It is to know that one act by somebody else changed the world forever. The guy that interrupted him made a very good point in that we did lose thousands of lives that day, but on any other given day, third world countries are losing children from starvation or for some other skirmish or whatnot, like all the time. And those are not things that we are giving credence to. And it's all about knowledge and what you know, and the fact that, and this is not necessarily something he said, but we really only care about this because it happened to us and because it was broadcast. People knew about it. It was a nice statement. What are we thinking about events like these, and why? And on one note, there's one other guy that this is something I'm so glad was put in the play, because I have always thought this would be a really important perspective to tell. The student was Muslim of some respect, or at least he was Middle Eastern, and his point was the people who did this are not representative of the people of the whole. Just like in the United States, certain factions are just factions, and they don't necessarily represent the entire nation and the entire nation's beliefs and thought processes. They didn't really go into detail, which is something that I would like to see, but he, to some respect, was viewed differently in the aftermath of 9/11 because the color of his skin, because of the clothing that he was wearing, because of whatever he was doing that was in respect to his beliefs or his nationality. I really liked that these students sought out diversity. We even had some special needs perspectives in there, which I thought was really interesting, because I think they are forgotten voices because they don't necessarily think and communicate the way we do, and so we, I guess, then think that they don't think at all. Anyways, I greatly appreciated this novel. It was another short read. I would love to know what you think of it. Do not get scared away by the formatting. It's really story-like in its delivery. So have some fun, and I'll see you next week. Bye.